Welcome to the Ministry and Podcast, authentic conversations about lament, endurance, and hope. This podcast is a production of the CCL Network.
I've had the privilege of serving in multiple lay ministry positions, everything from deacon, elder. My name is Chris Southam, and this is my story of ministry and redemption.
All right, well, welcome to our podcast, Chris, and welcome back to all of our listeners. We're just so glad that you guys are here to listen to the Ministry and Podcast. I'm Heather Walton, and
I'm Mike Edmiston. Thank you guys so much for joining us. And Chris, thank you for being our guest on the podcast today. I'm looking forward to hearing your story.
Well, throughout those years of ministry to this point, and I'm 64 now, I spent most of my time in I would say, the average size American church, 100 to 200 people. So all these experiences that I've had have been kind of the average, what probably the average church person would have happening in their own church. The one specific story, and there are several that I could choose. The one specific story involves a church that I was in. I was in a initially position as a deacon. This was a church where the deacon took the elder sort of role. It was just called deacon. And in this church, I was also at a certain point elected to as the chairman, if you will, of the church board. So I was kind of in that chairman position. I was fairly young, probably 35 at the time. I would consider myself young. You guys might not feel that way at this point, but
35 sounds awfully young to me, Chris. I don't
yeah, well, no further comment on that. In that church, we went through a pastor, a beloved pastor that retired and actually moved on to a teaching position in a college, and through that, we had to go through a pastoral search for a new pastor, which was largely assisted by the denominational oversight of the church at the time. I could make comments on there's probably improvements I think that could be made in the way pastors are called to churches today. I have a lot of thoughts on why that maybe doesn't work all the time as well as it should, partly because of kind of the business model that we set up in a church, and sort of the interview process is very much like the business world, which I'm from, where you've got a set of qualifications and duties. Much of the time with a pastor is spent on looking at the qualifications, not so much the duties, unfortunately. And I think that maybe is a drawback. It's been rare. I've been on several of those, and it's been rare that those individuals came back and wanted more clarification on the duties of what the church truly was expecting of them. It was more of the focus of the interviews, and the discussion was set on the qualifications, which is very much from the business perspective, but it moves away from a spiritual approach, I think, to calling a pastor. In this case, the pastor was called very quickly. The denomination had a very good process where there was a number of pastors and a number of churches searching at the same time, and they set up a situation where we could interview multiple pastors. This pastor stood out very well, very gregarious person, and very quickly, majority of the group decided that we wanted to extend him an offer. So it happened very quickly. The pastor was a gregarious fellow, had a good ministry partner in his wife, came in, was not from the conservative denomination that we were in at the time. I think the initial probably 6 months to a year, things went very well. It was a kind of a honeymoon time where you're feeling people out and so on. But there came a time when things started to happen for him. Kind of set aside a small group that I think everything was done with good intentions, but in a way that, separated them from the majority of the congregation, more newer people, which, at the time we applauded because he was trying to bring in, focusing more on younger couples and things like this. So the church felt that was a good thing to do to grow the church. But at the same time, there was some deviations in some of the things that he would be preaching that raised some eyebrows, especially some of the senior long-term members of the congregation that in some cases almost could be considered inappropriate. So there was starting to become some friction at that point.
Are you looking to strengthen your ministry skills and help your church grow? The Christian Church Leadership Network exists to keep ministry leaders like yourself connected, supported, and equipped so you can lead with confidence. Enjoy free webinars from seasoned ministry veterans, stay informed with insights on emerging trends, and access exclusive resources such as Level Up Preaching and Kids Ministry cohorts and Healthy Church co-ops. Plus, visit ministrycareers.org to post or explore ministry job opportunities. And for an added bonus, look for our section in the Christian Standard magazine titled Ministry Edge for regular publications. From skill development to career advancement, the CCL Network provides a support system and resources you won't find anywhere else. Visit ccl.network and discover how the CCL Network can help you thrive. The Christian Church Leadership Network, helping churches and church leaders thrive.
Friction at that point. As the chairman of the board, it was very difficult for me to referee those things that were going on. We obviously, myself and a couple of deacons spoke to him about a few of these things. There came a time, and it's not important what the message that he was preaching was, but there was an item in the sermon that was actually non-scriptural. So, it was, if I told it to you, you'd say, "Oh, yeah, that's not right." So I'm not even going to go into the detail of it, but the bottom line was at the end of that Sunday, I went home and I thought a lot about it, and I decided I was going to call him personally and just discuss it and say, "Hey, I'm not sure I understood what you were doing here, but I didn't feel it was appropriate." Well, that was when things very quickly for me changed. He more or less responded to me that, I was doing the work of the devil at that point, coming against him, very upset at me. And then I guess began to be abusive in some ways towards me. And as the chairman, I spoke with the rest of the board about it, and they was kind of in agreement that this is something that was probably the point where we couldn't continue on as we were. I went, I think, trying to go through all the details of the timeline. I'm trying to, kind of make it a little more, skip through a few things so it doesn't take as long as I wanted to or could. But at this point, the board felt that it would be best to ask him, to resign. So a letter was drafted that week and sent to him. He responded saying that he would preach his last sermon on Sunday and then he would resign. There was a lot of trepidation about that. So we basically said, "Look, we'll accept your resignation, but we don't really want you to preach on Sunday." So Sunday, none of the church was aware of this at this point. Sunday morning, I was given the unenviable task of standing in front of the congregation explaining what had happened. We had requested our district leadership to be able to come and provide a supply pulpit person to preach that weekend, but I had to stand up in front of the church and make the explanation of what had happened. I opened my mouth, said a couple of sentences in an introduction, and then the whole back row of the church stood up, began yelling and screaming at me, telling me that, I was lying and and that it was a coup to take, over the church and all these kinds of things. And then they all told everybody if they were smart, they would leave because that's what they were doing. And off they trooped out the back door. So that was pretty rough. At the same time, the pastor himself went to the district superintendent and, complained about how the church had treated him in a kind of a very bad manner. And so the district superintendent called me and began to dress me down as to how how that had gone and how we had, and I said, I said, and I believe God was moving me at the time. I said, you need to come down here and you need to talk to people. I know you've heard from the pastor and you should hear from him and hear what he has said, but there's people here that have experienced his ministry. I don't think it's good for you to come down and interview them and find out, from them. Don't listen to me. Don't listen to the board, and see and then draw your conclusion. So he agreed to do that. And again, I believe that was from God. And through all this time, I would say we didn't lose any other congregants. So they all were, pretty much on board with where we stood as a leadership team. Which stuck together as well, I have to say, despite the fact that I was coming under just this intense, sort of what I kind of persecution in a way, everyone stood behind me, which was heartening. It was incredibly stressful, I guess, for me personally. To kind of complete that side of the story that I started there, the district superintendent did come down. And he did set up a bunch of interviews over a weekend and talked to everybody, came back with his findings and, basically absolved myself and the board of the accusations that this guy had put forward and other people had called and put forward against us. So, but during that time, I think, if I remember right, I lost probably 15 pounds because I was under such anxiety and stress that I couldn't even eat. So I didn't have any appetite through that probably a 2-month period. So it was very, very intense. And I was not in the pastor position. I was in the lay leadership position. I think the good part about the whole situation is that, for many years, I really struggled with the individual afterwards. And by the way, that church has gone on and continues to be a successful, if you will, whatever the definition of a successful congregation might be, growing and serving God in their community, and presenting Jesus Christ to them. I do feel that they've been able to do that. Have been able to, I would say, probably 10 years ago. So I'm now 64. So 20 years after that, I approached the pastor directly and basically we had some back and forth discussions and, everything, forgiveness was granted on both sides. And when I say my experience was redemptive, it was, because not only were we able to, at the end of the day, remain, if not friends, acquaintances and in right standing with each other, but also the things that it taught me about continuing to stay the course with God, constantly trying to pray and seek the will of the Lord and what he would have me to do in those times, and with others, with the rest of the team, to do that as well, taught me a great deal about church leadership, about how fragile it is, how careful we must be with our words and the things that we say, how being a younger person is a challenge as a leader, because, and scripturally we know that's true. In Timothy, it talks about not being a novice, or in terms of coming to Christ and then instantly serving and things like that. So we know that's scriptural. It really showed me that without some level of experience, somebody could wilt under that pressure quite easily, possibly shipwreck their faith, as it talks about in the scriptures. So those are some of the things that I think were redemptive to me. Also, I think it made me think a lot about how can we avoid, these kinds of things as well. And when I said before, too, that this wasn't the only situation, I was thinking before I was asked to come on here about those that I know in pastor roles that have no longer serving. And it's a challenge right now for the local church, as you guys know as well, to get young pastors, into wanting to be, or in recruiting young pastors to go into college courses and college, streams of education that bring you towards a pastoral role. Like those are, there's not a lot of kids going into that anymore. Kids have seen pastors kind of been treated in negative ways as well. And I think that's a challenge for all of us, and along with this concept of the megachurch movement, our small traditional churches are left, with a very small group of people ready to take the reins and move and continue on serving. I would say out of those, I was thinking there's 5 pastors that I know right off the top of my head that I knew that are no longer serving, and at least 2 of them are totally outside the ministry, like totally outside. The other 2 of the other ones are sort of in a parachurch style ministry, but 2 of them are totally almost left the faith in a way. They left their calling for certain, and that's sad. That's sad. So I really questioned myself. What are the things that we are doing or could improve on doing to make pastors, to avoid these kinds of things, these tremendous hurts in ministry that end up, fracturing churches and leaving people outside of their traditional, or the calling that they were called to. And I have maybe a couple that I thought of. I mentioned the one with sort of the business model of the church. Many churches have this kind of business model of a church board, and usually they're businessmen that are in those positions. They're very focused on achievements and things like that. They're very focused on a job description and annual reviews, dollars and cents, people in the pews, all these kind of things. And I think that can take away from it can separate a pastor from what he is truly called from on the spiritual side, to constantly have to be measured on the physical side of things. I see that as an issue, and I don't know that the young graduates coming out of college today are equipped to be able to do that.
Chris, that's there's so much to unpack there, but the first thing that comes to mind is just how much I appreciate the fact that you didn't jump ship in the worst of times, because it would have been a whole lot easier. It would have been so much easier for you to say, you know what, I don't need this, I'm out. You didn't do that. And so not a question as much as just a statement of appreciation. Thank you for staying. Thank you for sticking through that when it would have been a lot easier to bolt. I really appreciate that.
I think it's helpful for us to share those stories of endurance and sticking to a situation that's hard. I don't think we hear a lot of those stories. It reminds me of earlier in our ministry days when there was a transition of a youth minister out of a role, and just the hardship the toll that it takes on your personal body and the body of Christ. The way that it affects the church and the way that the ministry is functioning is one aspect of it. And you kind of talked about internally, even physically, the way your body reacted to that. I'm curious to know a little bit more of spiritually what was going on. What were the things that you were wrestling through on your own with the Lord in those times where you were trying to figure out how to keep your church moving forward, but also to take care of yourself, and I would assume your family, in some of those scenarios that are just tricky?
It's hard to kind of make a list of it. I think the foundation that I had with my family, my wife, being a strong believer. We had 4 small children at the time. I'd say up between, 2 and 10. I think that foundation of the family and having the place where it was a sanctuary for me outside of that was super important. I also had a huge mentor in my father-in-law, and I was able, I think, to share with him, some of the things that I was going through, and he was a good listener, didn't offer me a lot of advice, but was also there as kind of a third party. I think that was super important. He wasn't obviously from the same church, so that was good. And I think the leadership team at that church was probably one of the best that I have served with in terms of their support for each other. And maybe it's through the difficulties that comes forth. I don't know. Maybe that's part of it, And when I think about the redemptive aspect of these things, that's what I sort of see is that, when God's going to show up when times are tough. And I think we believed that. We believed all along that we were doing the right thing and doing the best that we could for our group. I don't ever recall, to be honest, having a moment. I probably had moments, but I never entertained the thought of running away from it. I think I took too much responsibility with my role to just run away from it. I knew that it was important to keep the church together.
Well, Chris, I know former leaders who did run away from it when it got tough. So again, I just appreciate you staying. But something you just said that I've seen in my own life, you said that leadership team grew stronger, got better because they walked through this together. I led a turnaround church for a long time, 17 years, and the start of that was really hard to start turning that around, and we had a lot of tense meetings. I never had anybody in a congregational meeting scream at me. I've been yelled at plenty, never in a meeting like that though. But I do know that the leaders that stuck together through the worst were better for it. And I hope I hope people who are watching or listening to this are encouraged if they're going through that tough time, that man, it really will strengthen you and make you a better leader. But something, my question is, the people who left, the people who got up, yelled at you, accused you of lying, all this stuff, and left, there are churches, and I know a bunch. I've been in a few who, anybody who left, there's this mindset of we got to chase them. Nobody's allowed to leave and everything, and I'm just like, guys, if I take Advil to get rid of a headache and the headache goes away, I don't chase after the headache. I'm glad it's gone. So, I mean, what would you say to somebody who's struggling? Like, there's some people who are leaving, but maybe they need to go. I mean, what did that look like for you guys?
Yes, that's a very good question. I mean, it's true to say I believe that, whenever the church is attacked, it's comes from within, right? I mean,
Yes,
God's very clear about it, right? The wolves are within. And so there are times where those people show their, I don't know if you want to call it true colors. I don't know what you want to call it, but
yeah.
at a certain point, you're those people you might not want to chase after. I think I do know there were some people within that group that did come back. They were within that group because it was kind of set up as a small group by the pastor. So there was there's going to be some tight-knit bonds, and there's going to be some group think, I guess, if you want to call it that, the way things get done. So, but there was some people that reflected on it later and said, wait a minute, that wasn't right. And they did come back.
That's
Not
awesome.
many, but a few.
That's awesome.
So, and obviously as a leadership team, we prayed for those people, every single one of them, right? Even the one guy that I would kind of categorize more as the main troublemaker. Even him, because we had a relationship with them too. We knew those people to a certain extent. And I think that's all you can do.
So, Chris, at one point when you were telling your story, you used the word abuse or abuse. And I know you don't use that word lightly, but that's something that's it's really come into more clear focus, I would say, in the last several years, that spiritual abuse within a church is a very real thing. And I found myself even counseling with some people who were in a church that the pastor was very abusive. There's something powerful when someone is in a spiritual leadership role and leverages that role in an abusive way. The pain and the fallout from that is just greater. If you've never gone through that, I'm not sure you understand how far that goes. So what does it look like for you to navigate through that and heal through that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because it can come in a variety of ways. Sometimes it is an open emotional, raw wound or something that's created, or in a verbal way. But, sometimes it's done in very subtle ways through kind of the leadership, I don't know what to call it, but hierarchical method. In other words, I am this person. I've been here for so long. I've been, this, So there's situations like that where people are granted a special position almost. I'm not sure how they get it sometimes, but it's true that it's there, and it's perceived by all. This person's a pillar in the church, whatever you want to call it. No, they're not really a pillar in the church. They're no different than the rest of us. But yet, for some reason, they're granted this position of power in a way. And I think that's also one of the ways Satan subtly gets into the church. The abuse that they create is often against the pastors. I find in a board type setting, where I've been in a couple situations where the board of the church ran the show. They told the pastor what to do. And that's kind of on the other foot there, where the pastor was in a sense abused because they were not allowed to really develop the role that God was pushing them towards. They had to develop the role that the church leadership was pushing them towards. And it's a subtle thing, because Paul does say to Timothy, do the duties that you were called to do. So if you have a situation where you don't have a strong relationship between all the members of the board, including the pastor, you're subject to have those things start to happen. And they can, when they blow up, as you said, they can be messy. They can split churches. They can create division and deceit within the body that sometimes never gets addressed.
Yeah, unity is so crucial among the leaders. But
Yes.
if there's any one leader, I mean, one of my mantras is a leader who cannot be questioned is a highly questionable leader.
Yeah, that's good.
And it doesn't matter who it is. None of us are above being questioned, being called on stuff, because that's how that abuse takes root, is when a person can't be questioned anymore, and it's just a very dangerous place to be.
Yeah, it really is. But thinking about an example of that, I had a couple of elders on the board, and one of the elders said, well, I think God is telling me this. As soon as somebody says that, you're now becoming, I'm speaking for God, right? So it's very difficult to go back and say, well, wait, or not even I think, but God told me this. And then to have another elder come along and say, hey, if Joe heard from God, who am I to say, that's got to be right. I've actually had that happen on board decisions. And you think about that and you're like, wow,
Yeah, it's the trump card that, I mean, if you really believe that, what are you supposed to do? So that
right?
is
It shuts down all conversation. It's over.
It does. That is such a tricky place to be.
And what I remember my other point, you mentioned your mantra. My mantra is that unity is possible. Might not always be easy to get to, but it's always possible. I've had even pastors say, well, we're never all going to agree. If we haven't agreed, we better go back and pray some more and then come back and talk about it again, because there's only one Spirit. There's only one voice of God. Maybe we're not always going to find it together at the same time, but we have to at least admit there is only one, and we should seek that unity above all else, right? So that I agree 100% with what you said about that, with the unity side. It's so important that we recognize that unity is possible. It's not, we don't just sit back and have our own opinions and try to convince people about it. And that, again, comes from the business world, right? That's how we act in the business world. I know I've been a VP level all the way down. We go in and we have our axe that we are going to grind, and we have to convince as many people as possible that it's correct, so that we can, we need to persuade. That's not biblical leadership.
Yeah, and as we're thinking about some of these potential dangers, I'm just curious what some of the reflections that you've taken in your time as a leader to have certain guardrails in place. I've heard prayer is first and foremost, having those open conversations and some communication with those that are leading alongside you. What are some other guardrails for those potential pitfalls as you're trying to shepherd others?
Yeah, I mean, again, if you read the two letters of Paul that are, mostly associated with church leadership, Timothy, right? The main focus that Paul is telling Timothy is be in tune with Christ, right? Be in tune with him at all times. And that's the main focus you can see throughout both of those books. And I think that's number one, is our relationship with Christ has to be in the right place, or we're subject to, things that the world might bring in and push in our direction, right? We've always got to say, God, I don't, if this is right, is it, and compare it against the Word, obviously, and make sure that we're right with God and unconfessed sin and all those things at the same time. So that relationship with Christ is another huge guardrail, because it will keep us on track, or at least partially, depending on how our fleshly thinking comes into it at times, but it will help. I think the mentor aspect is another one. If you have somebody that is a mentor that is wholly separate from the situation that you can talk about, sometimes you can gain either another perspective, or through just speaking about it, you hear yourself, and it can be helpful to to see it from a different perspective. So that's important as well. And I think for the young leaders, those things are very important for coming out of Bible college and stepping into as maybe just a young married couple with a small family into a church setting where there's going to be some very high expectations. You really need to make sure that you're in tune with your walk with God, that you're, Timothy also talks about having in the qualifications for leaders about having your family in order and these kind of things. It stops minimizes the foothold that the devils can have, right? If I'm constantly, having marriage issues and I'm heading into a pastoral role, that's a place where Satan can attack, right? So we want to make sure that we're careful with all those kinds of things.
Yeah, you mentioned that you guys called this guy on the carpet about some things that he said that were pushing the boundaries, but before he even got to just saying things that were blatantly unbiblical. And I actually had a flashback because when I was a young preacher, I liked to push the envelope, and part of that was I was following some megachurch guys that have since been discredited in a lot of ways, and I'm really ashamed that I let them have any influence over me when I was a younger leader, but I did. But it took me back to an elders meeting where they called me on some of this stuff. Nothing I was saying was anti-biblical. It was just stupid. It was just foolish. It was
Yes.
It was crass. It was just dumb. I was just being stupid. But they cared enough about me to call me out. So, you were talking about qualities of young leaders. I would rank humility way up there. And that, when you called him on it, this guy's like, you're being a tool of Satan. And no, these guys were telling me what I didn't want to hear, but what I desperately needed to hear. So,
yeah.
Chris, sounds like you got a friend there with you.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm just pushing.
That's good. No, I'm a dog guy. I like it. But thank you for having the courage to step up and call that out, because I know the guys that did that for me, I know it was not easy for them, but they cared enough about the church and they cared enough about me to have a hard conversation.
That's great.
Yeah.
And and it's good that you were able to hear that, not everybody can hear it.
I didn't want to hear it, but I needed to hear it, because they were right. They were right. So Chris, what advice would you give to someone who's serving, maybe not on a staff role, but a lay leader, an elder, a ministry leader, things like that? What can those leaders do to encourage their ministry staff? Because you were talking about how abuse can go both ways. I mean, I know churches where if you talk to people in the community, they'll point me like that's a preacher killer church. And they mean it sincerely, like to just grind them up.
Yes.
So how can those leadership teams be a support and encouragement to people in vocational ministry?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one of the things that I had briefly touched on earlier is, when these people go through the interview process, it's rare that I can ever think of a pastoral candidate wanting to actually refine a question ask a question about some of the duties that the church has. I think many cases, the grinded up, spit it out could have been avoided if the candidate A had maybe asked some further questions. Hey, in your duties here, it says you want me to run a highly organized children's ministry. What is that? What do you really mean? What's your children's ministry like? What do you want me to do? Like, I've rarely heard pastoral candidates ask that. And I think, they need to focus on that part of it, because that's where that's where you become judged, if you will. You're not, everybody goes through the qualifications, asks you all the spiritual questions, you tick them off and everything's great. And they say, okay, that's great. Let's bring them on in. But those things, if those are covered, those are just the start. Those are the minimum,
Yes.
right? So those are covered. Now what does the ministry look like here for you guys? And I think that's where we have issues, where there's a disconnect.
I'm just having another flashback listening to your story. This church that I was in, when I interviewed, they said, of course, this is the right thing to say. When I asked this church, who is your target? I was interviewing to be the lead pastor. Who's your target? They said young families, because that's what you're supposed to say. So that's what they said. And I was young. I didn't push. I was just like, hey, they gave me the right answer. That's great. Well, fast forward, a year or two, and I'm there, and we actually are reaching some young families, but the people who interviewed me are ticked off at what's happening. And I finally had a guy, he was an elder at one point, wasn't anymore, but he came in, was reading me the riot act, and I said, you told me in the interview you wanted to reach young families, and I'll never forget his response. He said, well, I guess we didn't realize what that meant. And I'm like, not my problem.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you told me this is what you want, but had I dug deeper, that is great advice for people interviewing. Had I dug deeper, I may have found that out on the front end instead of being in the middle of it. Yeah, that's really good. What else would you tell churches who are searching, or leadership team who interacting with staff or potential staff?
I would say, there has to be some recognition that, that individual also has a calling and some area that God is going to want to direct them towards once they come on board. And we all have to, again, share that together. I think there's also another challenge area when it comes to ministry is the preaching and what the expectations are for the teaching aspect of their ministry. It's been traditionally, or I shouldn't say traditionally, but more lately, the more modern approach is these sort of topical and, current day-to-day messages, possibly, as opposed to an expository type preaching, possibly, also there's there needs to be a balance between the challenge aspect versus the blessing and aspect too. So those are areas that people tend to favor one of those types of preaching styles. That's another area I think that needs to be felt out by the pastor. I've always heard, oh yeah, we want you to step on our toes. Well, what does that mean? I've heard that.
Do you?
I don't know how many
do you really? Yeah. Do you?
Do you really? Do you really? Yeah. So that's, and if we're not doing that, remember I believe the church itself needs to understand that the pastor's role is to equip them for ministry also. That's another huge one where we have the pastor has to do everything. Well, the pastor is not visiting all the people in the hospital all the time, whatever, you've heard it. But the work of the pastor is to equip the people of the church for ministry. It's not to preach them a nice sermon and maybe have them participate in Sunday school or something. That's not it. It's to be like him. It's to be equipped for the ministry. And you've got people on your board that are not, they're on there because the guy's a good accountant, so he's going to be our accountant. He does that in real life. This guy's, an engineer, and we need somebody that can fix the furnace when it breaks. These kind of things. It's not done. People are brought on boards not for spiritual reasons, right? So another problem that we see. Doesn't matter if the furnace breaks, really, if we're all doing the right thing for Christ.
Yeah, so you've titled today's episode Ministry and Redemption. And so I want you to unpack a little bit more for us what that specific piece looks like, maybe a story or a summary of redemption from the story that you told.
I think part of it is everything that I've been through as a leader has, if I really allow it to, has taught me something. It's been part of God's plan for me. I believe that we can get, to allow a situation like we talked about, or like I've talked about, to take you out of the game, to take you out of the ministry is not what God's intention was to allow it to happen in the first place. And we really, truly need to understand that, yes, God doesn't want some of these things to happen, but God allows them to happen so that we can grow. And it's always redemptive in the fact that the things that you learn through the failures that you make. And I mean, as Mike has said too, he's a couple of failures. I've failed as well. I've been in situations where, I've had to confront people for, adulterous relationships. And then the way I did it was not right. And then the other spouse came back on me afterwards. And, so I've made all the mistakes, right? Too. So, but in all those things, God has been so gracious, faithful, and redeeming to me. I think of Isaac, I think it's Genesis chapter 26, where he's digging the wells, right? He's going around, and all the wells that Abraham dug are filled up. He's got to redig them, and then they fill them in again. Then they steal the other ones, he decides. He stayed faithful in the ministry. He stayed faithful. He knew he had the promise that land was going to be for Israel for all time. So he stayed faithful and did the things that he needed to do. And in the end, it says he became very great. Isaac became very great. He was a failed person, just like his father and his sons, but he kept the faith, and God remained faithful to him despite his failings. And that's what I think of as we think about ministry.
Yeah, that's God will redeem any hurtful, painful situation if we will allow him to do that. But we've got to avail ourselves to it. That's great.
Absolutely.
That's great. Well, Chris, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. I found just myself so many connecting points of my story to yours. And it just reminded me that, man, church is church and people are people. And
yes.
we're not as different as we might think we are, no matter where we are, what church we're in. It's just hard, but God is good, and there's redemption. So thank you so much for joining us today and sharing that story, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Thank you both for having me.
Hey, stick around, because the conversation's not over. Mike and Heather are going to unpack everything we just heard a little bit more. But we're curious about your thoughts. How did this episode connect to your life? How does it relate to the ways you've experienced ministry? And leave a comment, leave a review. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, we covered a lot of ground in that one. Again, just really thankful for Chris sharing his story from a really a different perspective. I mean, we're talking to a lot of people in the ministry, quote unquote, vocational ministry, but that ministry is what he's doing, and what he's done is ministry. And I appreciate his faithfulness to walking through some pretty tough times.
Yeah, for sure. I think it was really helpful for me to hear a perspective of a board member, an elder who is walking through a difficult situation where you need to have those hard conversations and you need to do it with grace, but you also need to do it in a public way to some extent so that the messaging that comes across is consistent for your whole congregation, that the leaders are all on the same page. So that's a really helpful perspective for us to hear from.
It is. And I just appreciate it, because I was on church staff, and when we went through hard times, I mean, there was a few times I'm like, well, at least I am getting paid. So, I'll endure it. He's not. I mean, that's right. Why I just have such a deep appreciation for volunteer leaders who do the hard things like that. But what you said is so key, that leadership has to be unified. I mean, disagree in the meeting room, but when the door opens, we have got to speak with one voice, because there is going to be someone who wants to divide and conquer. And I remember the most difficult days of our church transition. If I didn't have a unified leadership team, it would have never made it. I mean, we would have been dead in the water. And those leaders took shots for me that to this day, I don't even know about. I just appreciate that so much. So what else stuck out in the conversation to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that truly that's the only way that you do have that redemption story, when people can just be solely focused on what they have with the Lord and that alignment to truth, and then can lead from that position, not trying to get their own way or, to be divisive, but to truly do what is best for the well-being of the body of Christ. And, I think that is the kingdom come, that is where we see light breakthrough and redemption come about. So I'm glad that he framed it in that way.
Yeah, and if you're watching or listening to this and you're just going through it right now, first of all, I get it. I've been through it. Heather, you've been through it. Chris has been through it. Anybody that's been in ministry any length of time has gone through it. And no two situations are exactly the same, but just be encouraged that God redeems the hard stuff. I mean, that's the takeaway of this. God redeems the hard stuff. So we need you. We need you to stay in the game. Don't give up, because God is going to do what he's going to do. And he's in the redemption business. Resurrections come after crucifixions. He's always the God of, this isn't the end of the story. I'm going to redeem this for my glory and your good. So just hang on, guys.
Yeah. And I would invite you as a listener, if this resonates with you, we would love to hear your story and to be able to listen to other perspectives. If it's been helpful for you, if it's been an encouragement, please share this. Leave us a review so that we know that this is helping and that this is speaking encouragement and hope to your ministry.
Yeah. Thanks so much, guys. We'll see you next time on Ministry And.
The Ministry And podcast is a production of the CCL Network, hosted by Mike Edmiston and Heather Walton, produced by Jonathan Burian. The theme song is Rebels by New Alchemist. For more content, you can find us wherever podcasts are found and on YouTube at Ministry And Podcast. That's Ministry AND Podcast. If you or someone you know has a story to share, please contact us at ministryand@ccleadership.org. Or you can visit ccl.network for more information about the Christian Church Leadership Network, helping churches and church leaders thrive.